So is there, you talked about IRA, Islamic terrorism. Is there anything that sort of inspires these people uh, across groups or movements?
For
Uh,
sure, yeah. I mean, I think for years and years and years, we tended to assume that the person who joins a group like the IRA is fundamentally different to the person who goes and joins Al Qaeda or ISIS. I think the better the research gets and the more researchers we see coming into the field, the more we're seeing that the similarities are outweighing the differences. When we're fundamentally talking about people who are driven and fueled by some moral outrage. They see some injustice in the world, and their view is by my actions, by my violent actions, I am helping to make the world a better place. So that is one of several features that really unifies what on the surface might seem to be very, very, very different kinds of people and groups.
so in your experience, these people are not necessarily pathological or mentally ill, although I'm sure there's some overlap there.
Oh, for sure. And you're always going to have exceptions. You're always going to have people who are outliers within these groups who will display what would appear to be psychopathic or sociopathic tendencies. They tend to be the exception rather than the rule because,
Mhm.
by and large, psychopathy doesn't explain involvement in terrorism. And especially when it comes to thinking about, let's say, terrorist groups and organizations, they tend to be fairly good at screening out people would appear to be a little bit odd and unusual. When I first started studying this, I had the other assumption. I thought, well, surely being a psychopath would prepare you well for life in a terrorist group, and it turns out
Right.
not. It's actually not the case at all.
But
To be
why is that?
well, because psychopaths are driven by personal motivations. I mean, it's only ever about them and nobody else. To be an effective terrorist, you have to be able to willingly put yourself in danger for what you believe is a cause that is greater than yourself. That is fundamentally incompatible with the psychology of the psychopath.
So, in other words, that sounds like a kind of a common human trait where it's almost,
Oh,
idealism. I
for
think,
sure, for sure. So don't here's here's what I would say. Don't assume that the terrorist is motivated by anything other than the things that drive all the rest of us. I mean, we all look around, and those of us that are socially conscious and socially aware will see injustice. The difference is the terrorist comes to realize one way or another that the only way to remedy that injustice is to do is to commit violence against bystanders or non-combatants.
wow. How much of terrorism is, or people who become terrorists, are people who, for lack of a better word, are just kind of losers, or people who have nothing going on in their lives and who this gives them sort of an escape or like a grand narrative that they can piece together what their life means.
So that's an interesting question. I wouldn't equate being a so-called loser with
Yeah, yeah, no.
looking for something. I mean, you see all different kinds of people, not just across the spectrum of terrorist groups, but even within one individual group. So there are some terrorism specialists who will really focus on one movement or one type of movement, and you'll have others who will try to see or look for patterns across the gamut. But even within specific groups, you'll have people who are some are what we could call genuine losers. They have failed at everything that they put their minds to, and they might view their involvement in terrorism as almost a kind of revenge. I mean, a way to
Mm.
push back against a society that person has viewed as failing it, or him or her. Um, Many people who join terrorist groups will at least tell you that they are trying to, as I said earlier, they're trying to make the world a better place. Now, that might be something that they tell themselves to convince themselves about the righteousness of what they've done. It can be very, very difficult to disentangle what initially pushed a person down that pathway to the kinds of things that they themselves later then use to justify their behavior. Because people change as a result of being in these groups. They might initially walk the walk in terms of expressing a willingness to do things in these groups or as on behalf of these groups, but it's only after a while do they start to acquire a way to justify to themselves and others what exactly they've done. So in a way, the ideology often comes later on. But people join for all different kinds of reasons. Some are true believers. They really do buy into the ideology. They buy into the notion that the only way to right this wrong is to engage in acts of horrific violence against non-combatants. Others get involved because, as you said, they're bored out of their minds. They have nothing going on, and it can be really challenging when you have an older sibling who decides that he wants to go off to Syria, and what do? You're left to stay at home and look after a younger sibling or parents or whatever it might be. So very often the kinds of things that will initially pull somebody into terrorism are little more than adventure seeking, camaraderie, excitement, a sense of adventure, a sense that just something better awaits you out there. And afterwards, that's when someone might get ideological. The real challenge is when I, as a researcher, catch up with that person years later and try to get a sense of what motivated them to get involved. We get this mishmash of different kinds of factors, and it's really, really, really hard to figure out, okay, well, but what happened first? What's the sequence of events that led to you going down this pathway? That's our task as researchers.